Hello and welcome to Mergers and Acquisitions, the podcast for Society for Economic Anthropology, produced in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. I'm Xinyan Peng, and I will be your host for the series Ethnographies of White-Collar Workers in East Asia. This series, supported by the new Media Lab at the Department of Anthropology at Sun Yat-sen University, is composed of 3 episodes where I interview 3 anthropologists who have conducted research in East Asia. 2 episodes delve deep into the physical space, historical context, social form, and cultural meaning of work among management consultants in China and corporate professionals in South Korea. One episode about Japan will take a more holistic perspective to interrogate the intersection between political economy and personal life, more specifically, labor and intimacy. Altogether, this series hopes to further our understanding on the political economy of several East Asian societies, as well as the everyday work and life of white-collar workers in this part of the world. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Mike Prentice. Dr. Prentice is currently a lecturer in Korean Studies in the School of East Asian Studies at the University of Sheffield. Dr. Prentice has been trained as a linguistic and cultural anthropologist, and his research broadly focuses on genres and technologies of communication, organizations and corporations, and work and labor cultures in contemporary South Korea. Dr. Prentice's book, Supercorporate: Distinction and Participation in Post-Hierarchy South Korea, examines a central tension in visions of big corporate life in 21st century South Korea. Should corporations be sites of fair distinction or equal participation? As South Korea distances itself from images and figures of a hierarchical past, Dr. Prentice argues that the drive to redefine the meaning of corporate labor echoes a central ambiguity around corporate labor today. Even as corporations remain idealized sites of middle-class aspiration in South Korea, employees are torn over greater recognition for their work or meaningful forms of cooperation. Through an in-depth ethnography of the Sangdo Group conglomerate, Supercorporate examines how managers attempt to perfect corporate social life through new office programs, while also minimizing the risks of creating new hierarchies. Ultimately, Supercorporate explores what South Korean offices should look like in a post-hierarchical world and reveals how office life is a battleground for working out the promises and perils of economic democratization in one of East Asia's most dynamic countries. Welcome, Dr. Prentice. It's a great pleasure and honor to be able to talk with you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm a big fan of your work, and I think your work is really important and helpful for us to understand contemporary corporate life and white-collar labor in East Asian contexts. In the introduction of your book, Supercorporate, you write, the term supercorporate captures the sense that larger corporate organizations cannot be reduced to sites of pure economic or organizational function alone, nor are they solely the objects of control by owners or capitalist institutions. Rather, they're loaded with broader sociocultural significance. So how have South Korean people participated in the larger life of corporations, and what forms of distinction do corporations make, and in what ways in today's South Korea?
Thank you for this question. Let me start by talking about, how I developed this idea of supercorporate, and it really was more of a challenge to me how to describe not just ethnographically, but also anthropologically, corporate life in South Korea. I had always been interested in kind of white-collar work dynamics in Korea since when I was working in New York City and did some collaborative work with advertising agencies in South Korea about 10 or 15 years ago. But when it came to actually, obviously I did a case study in a group that's called the Sangdo Group in the book. And when it came to actually doing the case study, I had to think, well, am I doing a case study of an organization, of all corporations in general? And I think there's a long tradition in the kind of organization studies world, the sociological studies world, on doing kind of organization, looking at the norms, looking at the work culture, this kind of shop floor notion. And of course, I'm interested in that. But I think as an anthropologist, and when you're talking to people, you notice that they are talking about the corporate world in general quite a bit. And one of the things I started to realize, or that made it difficult to just do a shop floor study, so to speak, or looking at just the norms at one office or the local culture, so to speak, is that there's this constant reference to, well, well, Samsung's doing this, or Hyundai's doing that, or this company has these problems, or this chairman got into this kind of scandal. So there's this constant reference to the wider corporate world that is, of course, always indicative of any kind of cultural discourse, where the reference of the here and now is always in relation to the broader kind of discourse around, whatever it is. It could be family or nation or gender. But it always seemed to me that no one really had done that with corporations, right? There's always this kind of isolation or kind of treating corporations almost as small tribes. And of course, no one does that kind of tribalism kind of trope anymore, thankfully. But I still found that it was difficult to, how do you talk about, a local work culture and also a broader kind of context of corporations. And that's where this idea of super corporate came in, meaning that not just big corporations or kind of large corporations, which they are very large in Korea, they still have this conglomerate structure, which has been called the chaebol, and I can talk a little bit more about why I don't use that term very much in my writing. But beyond just talking about the size and the kind of sheer scale, it's this kind of the resonance of this cultural discourse around corporations that was important for me to describe and important to kind of make space for analytically. And that's where the idea of super corporate comes in, which is the idea that anytime you're talking about this corporation or this office place, there's always a resonance to other places. And in particularly in South Korea, it's not just that this is a microcosm or this is any corporation. And that is, and whenever I talk to anyone in South Korea, they would always say, oh, well, we're very different from other people, or this company, you should go study this company, or we're not a good example. And I started to notice that there's this kind of awareness of implicit kind of distinction making across corporations. So it might be what we describe as fuzzy in the sense that, there's no hard and fast rankings between companies, but people were very aware of, well, you're not just there's no such thing as a generic Korean company or a generic Korean corporate culture. Samsung, which is often kind of seen as a paragon or paradigm, they're very modernized in the sense of leaving lots of traditional kind of office norms. So they're not really a good example. And then Hyundai has a kind of reputation for being a kind of a military organization. And so there's this kind of literally no generic kind of Korean office culture, but always a resonance that whatever culture or organization you're in, there is this resonance to, oh, are we above other people or below someone else, if that makes sense. So one person described it once as whenever new executives come in to the Sangha group, whenever they would hire a new executive, they would say, oh, that person has fallen from a bigger group, like a big finance company or Samsung kind of company, and they fall into us, meaning that we're sort of lucky to get them because we're slightly below in the prestige rankings. But so it was how to capture this sense that there was just this general awareness that everyone had about the broader corporate ecosystem that was not just purely economic at the end of the day, right? It's not just, well, here's the revenue of the top 10 companies, and that's how you understand the Korean corporate world. It seemed like it really needed an anthropologist to kind of unpack kind of the broader discourses that are happening.
Thank you, Dr. Prentice. I really love the framework you call the super corporate ideal. You define the super corporate ideal as the broader promise of corporations to realize and channel post-hierarchical forms of both interpersonal distinction and positive social interaction. So I'm fascinated by your perspective analyzing corporate life in South Korea from the perspective of hierarchy and distinction and participation. So how have anthropologists of capitalism and those who study corporations dealt with issues of hierarchy and distinction in the past? And how does your research relate to and differ from theirs?
It's a great question. I think the hierarchy issue is a kind of a lingering issue, and I have lots that I could say about it. I want to begin by saying, this study was inspired and partly built on the work of an anthropologist who passed away in the last few years named Roger Janelli, who was at Indiana University, wrote a fantastic book about a large Korean conglomerate in 1993, I believe, but he had done the study in the 1980s, and he was really the last person to do a kind of major ethnography of a Korean corporation. And in some ways, rereading his book, I still feel like his book is a kind of a masterpiece of writing, of anthropology, of synthesis, of theory. And so I was, building a lot on his work, and I had a chance to talk to Roger many times during my doctorate. But when I was doing the research, and obviously I had come on, with certain themes that I think were already we could call the discourse of South Korean corporations in at least America, right? Which is that they are different than American corporations. They're very hierarchical, resistant to change. These themes are, even though most people in America don't know a lot about South Korea, they actually know these kind of facts. And I think those influenced my early thinking. And so my early research applications, research proposals were about looking at techniques of democratization. Well, how do offices democratize? What does that actually look like in practice? So my early framing of the topic was around this central trope, I guess, in Western discourse around South Korean and partly Japanese organizations, that they are hierarchical, which is different than Western organizations, which are not hierarchical. And then so democratization obviously becomes the opposite of that. And there is lots of resonance. It's not like I went to the field and didn't find anything. Democratization, or what's called in Korea 민주주의화, is quite a vibrant discourse and has been going on since the 1980s. And if you want to change something in Korea, you try to democratize it. And that can be a bit vague in practice, but it's an interesting thing to look at. Well, what does democratization actually look like outside of the political sphere, and how do people try to interpret that into diversity of practices? But what I discovered through writing and obviously my own work is that if you frame everything as around this dynamic of hierarchy and democracy, you're completely missing out on what people are doing in corporate life or why people want to work. And it puts your informants, it puts the people that you've worked with, the people that whose lives and work you respect interpersonally and professionally, it puts them in a kind of strange light, because it puts them in a light where they are in a hierarchy. So and the way that we have come to think about hierarchy, unfortunately, has become somewhat simplified, in the sense that it tends to often refer to a kind of a simple power dynamic. There's someone who enforces the hierarchy. There's someone who is, subordinate or is victim to that hierarchy. And there is an idealized solution to that, which is, shouldn't we overcome that? And I think that's very common in liberal discourse, where hierarchy is seen as not a value that should be adopted. And in fact, it's the opposite kind of value of liberal discourse. But that is not true to what, the kind of worlds that my informants live in. They could recognize bad hierarchy. And there's lots of examples in South Korea about bad hierarchy, bad bosses, bullying, all these kind of things. And they're still going on, and they're still very important issues. But if you said, well, is your whole system hierarchical, or wouldn't you want to get rid of all of these management levels? People would probably say no. And that's why that's where I started with the book, which is the results of a satisfaction survey, where people do say that they find aspects of their workplace kind of oppressive, or there's what they call power harassment, or kapjil in Korean. But what do people want? They don't really want a flat workplace. They don't want a completely democratic understanding of work. They do want more distinction. They want opportunities to get promoted. They want opportunities to be evaluated fairly. And they want to do it in a kind of technocratic way, where it's not just up to an individual to decide, their skills or their worth in the corporation. So once you consider that, and if you take that idea seriously, or at least sincerely ethnographically, that is, without kind of denying it or just saying, well, that's an effect of hierarchy or an effect of capitalism, then you have to acknowledge that distinction is something very important for people and very important in people's lives. And it sort of fits uncomfortably in this hierarchy democracy kind of dyad. And so I had to make a lot of room for that as an analytic, as part of my thinking, and part of the argument of the book. And really the book, probably later in the stages of writing, became almost a defense of distinction as a way to move away from this discourse of, well, Korean organizations are very hierarchical, and boy, it would be really great if they got away from that,
because there's a lot of kind of Western or Eurocentric discourses that are wrapped up in that whole notion. And I've started to teach, since I've been at Sheffield, I've been teaching a master's course on kind of Eurocentric theories about East Asian economy. And the more I've taught about Japan and China in particular, the resonances of the old idea of the Asiatic mode of production or the Oriental despotism sort of are making a lot more sense now, and this kind of Eurocentric idea that, well, Asian organizations will always be hierarchical or have this kind of top-down structure, and this is the mirror of the West. So once you start to realize that there's this pattern, and you see it in your own work or your own thinking, you go, "Ooh, I need to get away from that kind of thinking to some degree." And this is where, I see distinction as a kind of as a way out, in the sense of it's at least provides. It's not saying that they are completely dupes of capitalism who are just intrigued by reward, but that this idea of corporations as being a possibly a kind of technocratic means of moving beyond hierarchy, in the sense of the patrimonial sense of hierarchy, meaning where it depends on another person, or it depends on social connections or those kind of things, and that you could have an idea of a system that does judge people fairly. Now, of course, within that, there is this idea of interpersonal difference, or that I think is very strong, and does, as a consequence, can lead to personal problems, bullying, competition, alienation, all of those kinds of things. But it's still, even when people recognize those problems, the solution seems to be, well, let's make it better. Let's keep working on kind of corporations as almost like I don't want to call it a technology, but a kind of a technocratic approach to designing kind of perfect distinction. And you see that resonance a lot in, popular culture, images of young people who are kind of oppressed at work, and wouldn't it be great if they were able to shine? Now, those are good narratives, but it's important to acknowledge that those are narratives where someone is able to succeed in a corporation. That's a different kind of critique of a corporation, when you say, well, this corporation, if I want to critique corporations, you say, well, maybe we should get rid of corporations, or they're a destructive form of a kind of capitalist system. But if what people are saying is, oh, wouldn't it be great if more people could work in corporations? Well, that's a very different kind of thing. I mean, you see this a lot in discussions about gender equality in the workplace. How can more people move up into middle management or executives or CEOs? There's sort of an acceptance of the normative idea that corporations are places of mobility in those kind of discourses. And, the more I came to think about it, I started to realize, well, yeah, distinction is kind of this unspoken discourse in Western institutions as well. So universities, I think when I was doing my PhD, I started to think, well, American universities are also quite hierarchical, in the sense of they have a kind of a three-stage hierarchy at the professor level. People take it very seriously, but people don't necessarily think of themselves in a hierarchical organization. They do think about it as a very historical, enlightened form of distinction, if I'm using my own terms there. But it doesn't. People, I don't think you would use the word hierarchy to describe the American professoriate. But that you do have the same ideas, that people are finding distinctions with the institution, not against the institution. And so in Korea, that's not an abnormal idea. There's, in the HR world in Korea, which is very big, there's lots of investment in how do you make performance measures better? How do you evaluate people fairly? How do you kind of create even little kind of pieces of software that can calibrate, how managers evaluate people, and do they do it fairly, and are all the team managers doing it in the same way? So this is where, the broader idea of the book kind of comes from, is trying not to throw all of this under that's just hierarchy, and hierarchy is a bad thing, or it's a creation of capitalism, therefore we should be very skeptical of it. There's plenty of things to be skeptical of, and there's lots of things about capitalism that I disagree with and are possible to criticize, even in Sangdo, and some of the managerial moves. But in general, thinking with my informants and thinking with kind of the sincerity of their own work, and not trying to distance myself from them or put them as just, okay, you're just capitalist cogs, really forced me to kind of change the way I thought about my arguments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prentice. I do find your argument very nuanced and really important. And I like the way you kind of triangulate democratization, distinction, hierarchy with distinction in the middle, negotiating the tension between democracy, democratization, and hierarchy. And I really appreciate the nuance in that framework. And it reminds me of your PowerPoint article. Sorry, I cannot help but refer to one of my favorite articles, The Powers in PowerPoint, that you published on American Anthropologist in 2019. And I think it's a really fascinating case study of how people use PowerPoint as a mechanism to work out the relationship and the tension between the individual and the institutional. And at the end, I really love the argument that you seem to be saying it's not just a cultural issue. It's not just something you find in South Korea or China or, the kind of hierarchical East Asian societies, so-called. But it's an organizational issue. Even in the Western organizations, you have to deal with the same kind of set of issues. But it's the way that people, Korean white-collar workers, at the same time appeal to their supervisors, their bosses' documentary taste, and also make sure that they can leave traces to allow space for the organization to give credit to their work and allow the space for distinction making. So if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, so that's where, thank you for bringing up that article. That was very fun to write. I'm glad I was able to write an article about PowerPoint and that American Anthropologist accepted it. I think, so one of the things, especially you see this a lot in the descriptions of East Asia, and I tried to drill this to my students that you need to get out of these kind of systems, but it's always hard because you see the East Asian business system or the Japanese business system or the Korean business system or the Chinese, management system, as if there is a kind of set system where everything is kind of set, and that, well, the hierarchy is determined by the labor categories, lifetime employment, all this kind of stuff, that there's kind of a very set of categories or fixed set of categories that people know about in East Asia, and that's what they all know about, and it's the Westerners' job to tell other Westerners about that system so that they can understand it. But obviously, when you go to any office place, there is it's not clear. Yes, there obviously is some basic HR kind of structures, but in the practice of work, which is what I was always interested in, what are people actually doing? That's where you see these kind of new zones of distinction. Now, in the book, I also write about, well, drinking is kind of a zone of distinction. Maybe it's not intended, but it becomes a zone of distinction where people measure themselves by how much you drink or how late you stay out or how often you go, those kind of things. That becomes a different kind of zone of distinction. But also PowerPoint becomes a curious zone of distinction, not by anyone's choice. In some ways, PowerPoint, and I talked about it in the article, was, well, it's a bit strange to say, but it was originally kind of conceived as a democratic technology in the sense that it allowed anyone to be a visual designer in the 1980s, when there was a kind of a stronger division of labor between graphics and maybe managerial or white collar work. And the person who designed it had this idea that anyone could be a designer, and that is partly true. And I don't want to imply that, well, once PowerPoint goes to Korea, then it becomes hierarchical. That's not what the point of the article is, but rather is that PowerPoint just becomes this new platform or medium through which hierarchy, distinction, participation all kind of come together, and people have to think about it in the terms of PowerPoint. Okay, well, my cover slide, how do I design my slides? How do I show myself? How do I show other people? These kinds of things. And so the PowerPoint is a kind of microcosm of my way of thinking, which is that not just, well, what is distinction and hierarchy and participation in Korea, but where does it happen? Where are the sites? Where are the forms of interaction or the genres where it takes place? That's why I generally talk about this idea of genres in my work, because I'm very open to things like considering next to each other or considering holistically or from the point of view of analysis. Well, where does, drinking culture and PowerPoint and meetings, how do they all fit together, right? Or how do people make sense of them? And oftentimes you find that there's quite a lot of discordance, or that the idea that, well, what happens on PowerPoint is not what happens in the meeting, is not what happens in HR, and is not what happens in drinking. And you have all these kind of strange forms of misalignment that happen where, someone feels like maybe they're really good at PowerPoint or really good at understanding their job, but perhaps they don't, other forms of distinction don't seem to align with that. And that's where you get a lot of, I think, workplace conflict, alienation in South Korea today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always a fun article to teach. I mean, students come up with all kinds of examples from their own academic life on campus. They are training themselves to be god of presenting, to use a phrase in the article. And since we've come to kind of your linguistic analysis, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. In the book, you have undertaken linguistic analysis of forms, genres, and techniques of communication, or what you call, I quote, infrastructures of distinction that lie at the heart of South Korean office life in many modern corporate organizations. Also, in other publications of yours, like the one that I mentioned, you've interrogated the issues of translation and the social life of office documents, such as PowerPoints. For our listeners who are mostly economic anthropologists and economists who might not be quite familiar with linguistic analysis in studying economic phenomena, would you explain to us why it is essential to pay serious attention to language use in the office, such as people's ranks and titles and office documents like PowerPoints?
That's a great question. I guess this is a pitch for why linguistic anthropology or linguistic anthropological idea around the work, and when work seems, or economics seems about not language, or language is perhaps superficial to economics. And there have been lots of discussions in the linguistic anthropologists who've worked on economy or political economy and around this issue, and kind of go against the idea that language is superficial to economy. Obviously, language is needed for any kind of exchange, any kinds of market interactions. There's lots of anthropological tradition from all over the world that have looked at this in some major articles. And I was fortunate to work or be at the University of Michigan when Professor Judith Irvine was there, and she had written a very kind of groundbreaking piece in 1989 on language and political economy. So I was very fortunate to be around people during my doctorate who didn't make a distinction or a difference between economy and language. I would say it probably took me a while to get over the idea that I needed to study language as a kind of specific thing, in the sense of looking at specific interactions. And I think when I first went to South Korea, obviously I wanted to do an office study. I had these dreams or desires to like set up cameras in a meeting room and film it and integrate video to really try to, and then really kind of break down what was going on, or talk to people afterwards, and which is a kind of method that is useful in linguistic anthropology for doing these kind of very micro detailed studies of meeting behavior and that kind of thing. As I discovered, doesn't work in a large corporation. You're lucky just to be able to get into a meeting, your ability to record it, to then talk about the recording. That's not really something that would have even been acceptable to even propose, as I learned or got used to the norms at Sangdo and other places. And so I realized that doing this kind of micro study of, let's say, meeting behavior as a kind of prototypical or stereotypical site of interaction was not going to work, and I needed to be a little bit more creative. And at the same time, I also, while I was doing the study, or was at Sangdo, I was trying to also think, okay, well, what forms of language, what forms of communication am I going to focus on? Every ethnographer has to make that choice. You always have to make a choice of where you're going to focus. And if you focus on one thing, that means you have therefore decided to ignore other things which people are doing in their everyday life. And at least in my ethnography, when I was working at Sangdo, I would just say, well, I'm going to explore whatever it is that they're exploring. And that turned into a really quite almost like encyclopedia of different genres and communication forms that was a bit overwhelming at times. I mean, just all the different kinds of communication work that people were doing in the corporation, the different sites that they were talking. I mean, you have meetings, smoking breaks, coffee breaks, office humor, elevator talk, emails, manuals, company magazines. So the list of genres, I was like, well, maybe I'll make a list of genres and try to figure out the relationship between them. And that didn't work. And I just realized, like, well, as anyone who else has ever studied a corporation, this must be really overwhelming and complicated. And how do you just say that there's just one norm and that norm is enforced in kind of everyday talk? Because there just seemed like there were so many places and so many forms where ideas of corporations or relations about workers or kind of the everyday order of things was being constructed, that it just almost became overwhelming analytically to try to pinpoint, well, here is the most important genre, or here is the most important site of interaction. What I try to do in my work, it may be in different articles. Somewhere I focus on PowerPoint, otherwhere where I focus on other things. I have a new article that just came out about drafting and like the process of trying to like draft documents. I guess it's a more of a nuanced argument about PowerPoint, but that you have to take all of these things into consideration analytically, or else you're at risk of kind of not missing the bigger picture. I don't want to claim that any one anthropologist can ever have a full picture, but there is a sense that you do, as a commitment to ethnography, you have a responsibility to look at all of the different sites of practice that the people whose lives you're interested in are participating in. So if you only want to look at meetings, well, you can do that, but what are you missing? What are you not looking at by looking at meetings? Well, in Korea, everyone, lots of people, they used to, hopefully they don't anymore, but they, go have a smoking break after the meeting, and then you kind of talk about how it went, and that's a kind of important genre. So if you're missing that, you're missing a kind of larger piece of what is happening economically or just socially. I guess the broader point, and this is always, I've never quite known how to answer this question, but because it feels a bit strange, but the question of where corporations sit within economic anthropology has always been interesting to me, because I think anthropology or economic anthropology, I'm not really a card-carrying economic anthropologist, but I'm always interested in corporations, and corporations are kind of a major institution of capitalism. But when we talk about economic anthropology, I think many people are talking about things that are, practices that are outside of capitalism in relation to capitalism, but so corporations have a kind of uneasy fit there. One, because they just, in the history of economics, corporations have consumed markets, they've consumed traditional forms of exchange and money, and they are a kind of vehicle of capitalism. So I think, while to me they're, very capitalistic and a site of economic activity, I always found that corporations, or doing kind of office work, fit a bit strangely in economic anthropology. I don't know how other listeners or readers feel about that, but I always find that, in contrast to the image of corporations either as kind of things that we should criticize within a kind of critical political economy, or just sites that are about kind of office dynamics and norms and such, that they don't look like, they just look kind of like mini tribes, so to speak. I do think there's lots of ways of investigating new forms of economic anthropology through different genres of work. I got very interested, just to wrap up this answer, I got very interested in the late part of my work at Sangdo, and I was able to go around to different departments. I went to the law department, or the legal department, the accounting department, the strategic kind of consulting department, the general affairs department, and in some ways that was good. In some ways that was just completely overwhelming as a method, because each of those departments has 50, written genres that they work with. They have their own kind of conceptions of work. They have their own ways of thinking about money. They have their own ways to think about risk, exchange, relationships in the organization. Some, legal department, they just think about risk and mitigating risk, and the way they look at a corporation is very different. Then I went to the auditing department. They think about like fraud, and they're just looking at everyone suspiciously. And HR department, they have their own kind of norms, but even half of the HR department thinks, okay, well, we can educate and train people, and the other thinks, well, no, people have very specific kind of views. So I guess the message is, it really, there are lots of sites of investigating different aspects of economic anthropology, even within a corporation. And in some ways, I that's why I try to focus a bit on say, well, I focus on an HR department rather than the corporation as a whole, or looking at the corporation through the lens of HR, where these issues of hierarchy and distinction come through. But if I had been in a different department, if I had been in the PR or the marketing department, it would have been a very different book, I think, at the end of the day. But I think still similar themes about thinking about what role do these genres play and how can we use those to study economic phenomena.
Thank you, Dr. Prentice. I'm very looking forward to reading your most recent publication. And well, I've been pounding on my students. If you're missing out the language being used in your field, you're missing out a lot. And we have been learning a lot from your work. It's been really eye-opening. And since you mentioned kind of the methodological aspect of the fieldwork process, I really appreciate the very inspiring and enlightening methodological appendix at the end of your book. And first, I love the way you organize the book, because sometimes people include that methodological part in their introduction, making the introduction unnecessarily too long, in my case. But your book has that appendix at the end where you take your readers from how to get access to your field, to what you were doing in the field, and what you figured out after fieldwork, and how you turned the fieldwork into the ethnography in front of us. And I think that's also where you bring readers to your kitchen and demonstrate the nitty-gritty of your fieldwork and thinking and writing. I think this part is incredibly helpful for those who are concerned about the methodological and ethical challenges of conducting fieldwork in corporate and institutional settings. So what are the methodological challenges and opportunities in the processes of gaining access to a field and navigating projects and relationships in the field? Could you share with listeners how your fieldwork experience has shaped your writing afterward?
That's a great question. And thank you for asking. I am very thankful that one of the reviewers of the book through Stanford, they said, well, they suggested putting in a methodological appendix, and we couldn't quite come up with a better term for it's not on. I kind of wanted to call it on methodology, and they wanted to use the idea of an appendix. But I said, I'm not going to be able to give you a sheet that said I did 16 interviews in this department or that kind of thing, and I said I'm not going to be able to give you statistics. But I think I was perhaps like other anthropologists who differentiate themselves from sociologists or other qualitative research. You're always a little hesitant about being too formal about the method, because there is not always a very clear rhyme or reason that you are kind of said, well, I had this method and this is how the study went because of that method. Obviously, there's lots of adaptation that anthropologists or other ethnographers are used to. So I think when we have to talk about method, that always gets a little scary. But in the process of writing it, I realized that that I could say something different. And that was to actually talk about method as a kind of wider thing, and not just about kind of, okay, well, what was your action plan on the ground? Method informs, how do you propose the research? How do you carry out the research? And importantly, how do you think about it afterwards? And I talk about it to students a lot. What is your analytical method? So we can think about research method as a matter of data collection. How are you going to collect data? Why do you collect that kind of data? But you can also think about analytic method, which is, well, then how do you analyze that data? Because you need to have some kind of method. So that the methodological appendix became a way for me to talk about actually the shifts in my thinking over time. And they're not huge shifts, but they were important changes that I made, and talked about what my method was at the beginning of my doctoral research, and then kind of by the time I was writing the book, 9 years later, how my thinking had changed. And that is, I think, an important aspect of method, not because necessarily we all hide that aspect, but I thought it's a, importance of being transparent and open in research, that's one thing I could talk about. There's obviously aspects of that I couldn't talk about, the field work that, completely insider view, how did I find that company, who introduced me to them? I don't think you need to be completely confessional when you are writing these kinds of things. But it is important to be transparent, at least about the process of your thinking and analysis. Now, when it comes to doing ethnography, it was extremely difficult to be able to find a place to work. There really hasn't been a lot of study on South Korean, workplaces. Not a major work since Janelli, and he did that research in the 1980s. And I was convinced that I was going to be able to be the next one who could do that. And I had some interviews, and I was fortunate through some connections to get interviews with executives at the beginning of my research phase, and that would have been in 2014. And then I would always ask at the end of interviews, so can I come work at your company for 6 months? And they just look at me like, oh, no, I'm sorry. And I felt, seems naive now, and I can't believe I actually tried to do that. But at the time, that was kind of my approach. I wanted to be, do things, in a kind of formal way and ask permission and those kind of things. And it really almost, and I didn't want to ask for some personal favors or work at a company I knew too well, but it almost failed actually. And I almost gave up, and about 6 months into it, I guess I would have had a year left. I thought, oh, maybe I'll study this completely other form of organization. I had met some small traders or small people who did like electrical assembly work, and they worked in this big complex in a kind of older part of Seoul, and they were really friendly. And I said, oh, maybe I'll study these guys. And I said, make a complete 180 on what I was doing, because I just thought the access would have been better, or at least easier. And then I was fortunate to have a few introductions, and I can't say exactly from whom and to where without revealing too much, but some fortunate introductions, and a company that I had known, I was able to get in contact with them again, and they said, okay, well, do you want to come and work as an intern for 6 months, and then we can think about extending you. And that was the way I kind of got back into the kind of big corporate white collar project again. And so thankfully I didn't have to abandon it, but it was very difficult, and gaining access is a major hurdle. And I understand why companies don't want to do it. Well, it's not really companies. I understand why individual people, when you talk to them, they feel like, well, I'm not the authority to have that power. I can't it's a huge risk to bring in an outsider and say, well, why did you bring in this outsider? Oh, well, they're going to write insider book about us to foreigners. That's not something that is going to help anyone's career. If someone asked me to do that, I certainly would say, no, go somewhere else. So in retrospect, I understand the rationale for it. And I think it's important that, as I'm going along and I have an academic position now to, what are some ways that we can facilitate organizational research such that you don't have these really high barriers, especially in East Asia, and where, not literacy, but awareness of anthropology or social sciences might be less, or companies might be a little bit more skeptical to outsiders or journalists or that kind of thing. And so how can we facilitate more knowledge, on companies in Korea, Japan, China, and other places? What are some ways that we can think about that, so we don't have this kind of huge hurdle where people are just getting shut, in the front door? I will say anthropologists who have gotten shut in the front door have done very creative things and have produced really good ethnographies outside of corporations. But I do think, it is important to understand what's going on inside, and that, I think people, we have a responsibility as a field to try to promote better access and methods for gaining access, if that makes sense. I don't know exactly what those look like, but we're at Sheffield. I'm going to have a workshop in May of this year, bringing in some anthropologists of East Asia and some sociologists as well. We're going to be talking about this issue of access and how people negotiate it and what kind of works today. I think one of the bigger challenges I was also doing field work even in 2023, and different than 10 years ago, is that the privacy regulations around technology have gotten much stricter, and it's going to be increasingly difficult to do any kind of research on site or looking at documents or getting access to technology or emails or those kind of things, because those have become increasingly securitized in the sense of, they've become an object of risk. And I think that poses a lot of really big problems for any kind of social science research in corporations. And we may have to be more creative around, how we do research and where we do research. But hopefully one way will be that, at least if there's some knowledge or on good kind of practices, on pathways to creating research or creating collaborative research contexts with corporations or with organizations. Hopefully, we can develop some of those as a field, and that will help the broader research environment in anthropology and related fields.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Prentice. Could I ask whether the upcoming workshop is hybrid?
It could be. I can let you know. It's I didn't think that many people would be interested, but if people are, it's called Working on, in, and with Organizations, East Asian Perspectives. And what we're going to be talking about is, especially in the UK context, this may not be a concern outside of the UK or other kind of environments, but there's a kind of new pressures or new, urges, but also a bit pressures to work or collaborate with partners, such that you must, when you submit a research proposal, you should have the endorsement of the company that you want to work with, or you're going to collaboratively produce knowledge. That is good. I don't have any problem with that in a general sense. It is a bit tricky for organizational researchers about how you co-construct research, and what are the themes that are addressed, and then what happens when you want to be critical of not corporations, or just critical of any aspect of a modern organizational life. And I think this is and even the idea that an academic and a corporation like partner together, I think is a bit strange, even in a kind of East Asian context where the corporations are huge and multinational and you're just a kind of one person. So I wanted to bring other people together to talk about, how do you deal with this and that kind of thing. I think there, at least in the American context, there is a kind of a bit perhaps resonance with perhaps new companies or startup companies, or even Silicon Valley, and the idea that and academics, where they perhaps might see each other as similar, or rebels, or going against certain norms, or perhaps even part of the same class group or something like that, where perhaps partnerships and can work together very well. But in context of East Asian organizations, as different as they are across East Asia, there feels like there's a much wider divide between, say, academics and organizations. And I think it's, as the pressures to collaborate increase, and not in a bad way, because that's an important part of the UK context, then I think it just poses some problems. Well, what does collaboration mean in the East Asian context, and what do informants think, or what do potential research organizations think about that? So that's what the workshop will be about. And if there's interest, we can make it hybrid and open so that more people can participate. Great.
I would certainly appreciate being able to hear you talk about these issues at length at that workshop. And also, I want to say that rarely do we readers of ethnographic work be given the analytic methods in your words. Sometimes we are provided the raw materials if the anthropologist is generous enough to let us see his or her field notes, and we get the book. But how do we go from here to there? And I think it's especially challenging for students in anthropology. They do field work and they are expected to write, but they don't know how to connect the dots and how to come up with their own analytic frame. So again, I really appreciate the methodological appendix at the end of the book. And from there, I also was able to see that you weren't just conducting your field work in the cubicle, like the space of work in strictly defined terms. You were also in the book, you talked about after-hours socializing and also shareholder meetings, and you wrote about shareholder meetings and after-hours socializing as part of the management and purification of distinction in corporate contexts. So how do shareholder meetings and after-hours socializing help constitute and also contest the supercorporate ideal?
Yeah, thank you for bringing this up. So if listeners are confused why those two things are together, those are the last two chapters of the book, where I do talk about these kind of special, I don't want to call them special occasions. They're very different, obviously, shareholder meetings and after hours socializing, sometimes just called drinking. But it's important, to go back to what I've been talking about. It's important to look at these other genres or sites of practice and say, well, what work are they doing? And if it's a very significant part of it, then you can't, a part of their life, then you can't ignore it and just say, well, I'm just going to focus on the work itself or the HR systems or whatever. And they reveal different things, and I think that's what's important. And they reveal very different dynamics. They don't. Every site in a corporation does not just reinforce the management message. It does not reinforce the capitalist message. There's lots of internal discordance across these sites. And so, for instance, you see the word democratization a lot, and like this idea of participation in the sense of leveling out distinctions, leveling out certain kind of aspects of negative hierarchy. But then you have shareholder meetings, which are actually, as I was able to participate in one of them and talk to people about them and go more into the background in Korea and also just in the broader literature on shareholder meetings. Shareholder meetings are a very kind of formalized sense of democracy from the view of parliamentary norms, in the sense of how can the minority have a right to speak? How can their views be heard? So it was, and then Korean shareholder meetings have all these very specific rules on this. And I talk about how the power of the minority shareholder has been sort of is enshrined in the shareholder meetings, but it creates this kind of dynamic where you have a potential minority shareholder meeting who can use the microphone at a meeting to just a person who has a very minimal amount of shares to kind of berate the executives and that kind of thing in public. And there is a kind of perhaps a shadow industry that uses that for extortion. And I write more about that in the book. But what the broader picture is that it is this, you do get this sense of, oh, well, this is a very radical form of democracy that is happening in the workplace. And how does the organization sort of change itself for this brief time, this 2 or 3 week period in the lead up to the shareholder meeting? How does the actual meeting itself have to, or force kind of an organization or corporation to kind of organize itself? I mean, to use it without lacking a better word there, in the form of a parliament or a representative democracy for a very brief period of time. So seeing actual democracy was quite eye-opening, because they say, oh, well, then what are all these other things that they call democracy, or kind of open meetings and that kind of thing? Is that really the same as, what a parliament form of democracy is, where, the rules are much more clear and defined? So it really, I think, is helpful to look at these small sites, even if they're not, important in everyday work, but they do happen over the course of a year, and they do shape different issues. And I talk more in the book, and I don't want to go into it too much, but the shareholder meetings become a site for people outside the corporation to leverage their views about, well, what forms of distinction should be made, and what forms of participation should be kind of addressed. The notion of what outside a corporation is, I don't want to, it's actually quite a tricky metaphysical question, because a shareholder is not outside a corporation, and they use that argument. And so they can claim to have the right to, decide what a corporation should do, because they are an owner of it and therefore not outside of it. And they should, in Korea, there's always an issue with foreign investors or foreign investment groups, and who want greater return on shareholder value through dividends. And that, I argue in the book, is a kind of distinction making, where they feel like they should be the ones earning the distinction through a monetary form rather than a kind of ceremonial or organizational form. And that's a tension that happens. Yeah, and if I were doing a study of shareholders and and owners and that kind of thing, that would be the big tension, I think. But it was interesting, even working in an HR department, I got to glimpse that kind of side of things, that other conflict. So I do see that as relating to the super corporate ideal, but I can only kind of give a smaller glimpse of it, because ethnographically, you can only see so much. Now, on the other side, drinking. Yeah, drinking is a I guess probably one of the first things you go when you go to South Korea, you learn about, the social life culture and whether you work in a corporation or not. It's not solely, obviously, corporate people that participate in after hours life, but it's clearly an important thing. And it's a huge area of contention. It's people hate it. They hate the normative pressure to do it, but other times people really like it. And it is fun. It's joking, it's singing and eating and having time, having fun times. So there's quite a lot of disagreement about it. People have very nuanced opinions about it. Well, I don't like to go out with these kind of people. I like to go out with my friends, and there's kind of political aspects to it. And so I didn't want to give a completely generic view of what the after hours culture was like, or you sometimes see that the after hours is that's where the real decisions are made. That's not necessarily true. You see that in some kind of descriptions, or that's where certain kind of social norms are enforced, like patriarchal norms or something like that. That does happen. There's no denying that. But there is just a wider kind of, as a kind of social genre, lots of things happen in after hours. And I talk for at least a third of that chapter, as a spoiler, I talk about golf and the role of golf in the Korean corporate world. And that is, it's not the traditional image of what after hours is like, but the people I worked with started playing a lot of golf, and I was forced to play golf for a very long time. I almost ran out of money trying to keep up with it. But it's just an interesting site where these kind of new forms of distinction happen. And I talk about a little bit with the golf thing, how consumer distinctions start to come in, and you start to think, oh, where are you playing golf, and what kind of clubs do you have, and what's your handicap. And these are the things they were talking about all the time in the office as well. What kind of clothes do you have? All this stuff. I think it's just important to acknowledge that you get these kind of unexpected things that are not just the expected image of the traditional after hours drinking culture, but there's quite a lot of change and diversity in what people are doing. But there are some kind of central tensions, I guess, around where distinctions are taking place. And I think the consumer aspect is one where you have you have this kind of consumerism, or and what goods people have is one way that people measure themselves, and that fits alongside other things. I mean, I remember the first time I was in the locker room at the company gym, and some guy had a Rolex out, and then some other guy pointed out, oh, see his Rolex, he got that for his wedding. And then I go, my outfit at this corporation is I'm going to be very underdressed at this corporation. But those kind of distinctions also creep in, and you have to think, well, how do you account for the fact that people now measure themselves with Rolexes and Prada shoes and that kind of stuff. So again, it's all part of the complexity of trying to understand where meaning making is happening. And I think while you can never say for sure this is the most important site of meaning making in this institution, there are lots of sites ethnographically where you can explore different dynamics of it. And that's what I think is fun about ethnography.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prentice. Well, I would say to listeners, if you want to know more about Dr. Prentice's work, go get a copy of Supercorporate Distinction and Participation in Post-Hierarchy South Korea. We've covered a lot of grounds with the book today, and I would just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Prentice, for speaking with us about your work and for elaborating on your theoretical framework, your analytic methods, your findings, and for giving us so much insight to learn from. Thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you for these wonderful questions.